Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Bollinger, and I am a psychotherapist, a clinical social worker, and a misfit mystic. And you are listening to the Happy Hippie Jesus Show.
Thanks for being with us today, Sarah. It's not very often we can get doctors.
Fancy, huh?
I know. I mean, most of the time, like they hear like the title of the show and they're like, I think I'm busy. Yes, but it's great to be with you today. And you've got a new book that's coming out, or I guess will be out when we release this. Excited to talk to you about it. But first, Bill has to embarrass me by asking the same ridiculous question he asks all of our guests. Yeah. And I can just say, I'm sorry.
Jeremy has this really bad understanding of Jesus. Apparently, Jeremy thinks that Jesus is a banker that just gets a thrill out of foreclosing on people. You know, that's the image that Jeremy has of Jesus. And I say, you know, Jesus is a much more loving and radical person. That Jesus is kind of a hippie. What do you think?
Gosh, I'd have to side with you. I really do think that Jesus tends to be more of a hippie. I mean, from what I understand about his life, almost everything he did was countercultural, on the margins, all about subverting power, turning upside down the structures of authority. And I mean, he hung out with the most edgy crew you can think of, right? I mean, women, prostitutes, all kinds of poor and sick people, and just was very radical. So I kind of think that Jesus as a hippie really works. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, so you're saying that Jesus isn't that banker from It's a Wonderful Life that wants to shut down the whole town. That's how Jeremy feels.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see it that way. I really do think part of the ministry of Jesus was to come and show, the last being first and the valleys being lifted up, and, sort of highlighting all of these things that we tend to forget about. So yeah, Jesus is successful yuppie banker. I don't know that I can't quite get into that.
My college logic teacher would call that a false dilemma, where Bill sets up this crazy choice where Jesus has to be one or the other. And he comes up with the most ridiculous straw man that he can. But hey, whatever it takes to get Bill a win. So tell us a story, Sarah. It can be from your own life. You can pick a Bible story. You can make up a story about a guy named Bill that sets up false or logically invalid arguments, like whatever you want to do. But tell us a story about how you understand Jesus.
I think this kind of goes along with the first question. Like I said, when I think of Jesus, I think of someone who really lived on the margins of life. And so, when I try to think of a story that embodies that understanding of Jesus, I am taken back to my time during some of my graduate work. I went to NYU and worked in New York City. And during my first year internship as a clinical social worker, I was assigned to do counseling and bereavement work with people who were on hospice care. I just moved to New York from the Midwest. I, was learning a lot. It was a bit of a shock to the system in a lot of ways, but I was assigned to work in the Marcy projects, which, if you know anything about Brooklyn, this is where Jay-Z grew up, where a lot of the famous rap songs, take place. And all the things you hear about in the songs are absolutely true. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of racism, all kinds of systemic issues sort of culminate in this particular project in Brooklyn. And so I was assigned to go in and counsel folks who were at the end of their life and also living in very extreme poverty and facing very extreme social challenges. And so, the one woman that comes to mind, she was elderly, I'm not sure how old, but dying of a chronic condition and really had no one and was kind of stuck alone in these projects. And it was heart-wrenching and so difficult. And the work was so emotional. And yet I couldn't help leaving our visits, our time together, and not thinking wow, this is where Jesus hangs out, right? This is what this is the example of how Jesus shows up in the world, in the most lonely and isolated and sick and dejected folks. Like, this is where the love of God comes crashing into our reality, because she was just such a wonderful, joyous, but insightful person despite the circumstances that she was dealing with in her life. So yeah, that's the story that really captures how I understand Jesus to show up in the world, how I see Jesus today.
That's certainly a story that resonates as true for me. A lot of times people I think I'm going to help or counsel or offer something to can teach me the most about God and help me understand things. And I find I often get more out of it than I could ever give.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
So you've got a new book. Why don't you just introduce it and you can give us your elevator summary of it?
So the new book is called The Awakened Life. It is an 8-week curriculum that helps college students delve deeper into mental health and wellness practices. And it was actually written and designed for campus ministers, chaplains, directors of spiritual life to help use with college students who are facing mental health issues. And what we did in the book was fuse a lot of our Christian mystic traditions, what we know about mindfulness and contemplative practices and prayerful practices. And we merged that with a lot of the existing research about clinical interventions for mental health diagnoses that use mindfulness and meditation practices. There's a lot of research now that demonstrates that mindfulness is actually an effective treatment for mental health problems. And as we were conceptualizing this book, we thought, hey, Christian tradition has a lot to say about this. What if we pulled from our own roots, pulled from our own traditions, and helped to put this into a compact, succinct guide that chaplains, campus ministers, and other leaders can use on campus with their students to help address some of these issues that students are facing, anxiety, depression, relationship issues. So that's the gist of the book. The college version just came out in May of this year. And then we're working with Discipleship Ministries right now to create a high school version, which I think will be coming out summer or fall of this year.
What led you into working or setting up something specific for high school and college students? Did you have like an experience working with that age group, or is that just an area that was missing?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So I, as a social work researcher and clinician, I have been on the university campus. Often I've taught a lot of classes and held a couple of faculty positions. So I know from direct experience that it's a huge need, and I have a good bit of experience with college age folks. But at the time, I was working with GBHM, the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, and I was specifically working in their collegiate ministry department. And so this was kind of a passion project, but it also really tied into that work that GBHM was doing through the collegiate ministry office. So it was both, kind of a drawing from my strengths and experience and also serving what GBHM had said that they needed at the time, which was a way to help address this on campus. So
I was really confused when your publisher sent us the copy of the book, because at first I thought it was a book about coffee. Because it was the Awakened Life. But then as I was reading it, I began to realize, this is something that students really need. And I'm very excited to hear that you're doing a high school version, because I have a high school senior myself. And I see just how much pressure they're under. It's not, I'm 47 years old. It's not like it was when I was in high school. You didn't put the kind of pressure these kids put on themselves today.
That's exactly right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, kids are facing untold number of, new pressure, new stress. And one of the biggest contributors to mental illness, what we're finding, is screen use, right? And always being connected. Not that technology should be demonized or we shouldn't use it. I mean, there are many, many benefits of smartphones and computers. And certainly there's so many things that have helped us along the way. But what we are finding is that anxiety increases, feelings of isolation increase, depression increases when we're addicted to scrolling on our phones all of the time, to the detriment of our relationships that we have in real life. So that was one of the major challenges that we tried to kind of take on and provide an alternative narrative to. Not that you shouldn't be on screens at all, but how can you be aware of their impact on your life? And how can you use them as a tool rather than them using you, right?
That's really interesting. You said smartphones, which I guess literally allow us to be connected through social media or text or calls to anyone, can actually increase our feelings of isolation.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. There's a new book called iGen and some research about kind of the impact of smartphones on this current generation. Forgetting the exact date that the iPhone came out, I think it was 2010, maybe 2011, something like that. But all of the data shows that, okay, the iPhone came out and there was a quick and sudden, like very, acute decline in connection to other people. There's a decline in dating. There was a decline in, going out without parents. It's just so interesting to see how our behavioral responses to this new piece of technology have changed so drastically.
Jeremy has little ones, but both of mine are teenagers. And I see that, but I don't see it as much with their phones, but with video games. They do these online video games, and that's how they interact with their peers.
Yeah, I mean, that's another huge piece of it, right? And that's just grown as well, in addition to use of smartphones. But this sense of relating only through technology, only through screens. And again, like video games with your peers online can be super fun and there's nothing wrong about them, per se. But if that trumps your ability to actually have a conversation in real time with a friend, then we've got an imbalance here, right? We've got an issue. So we speak to some of that in the book.
As you read through, your chapter titles all do with connection.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hearing we've lost some of that sense of how to connect, not just with others, but with ourselves, because we're so, I guess, busy and lost in technology.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really, that's kind of one of the central tenets of this book and these practices is that sense of connectedness, that sense of kind of oneness. And like you said, with other people, with creation, but primarily starting with us, right? We're so checked out and on autopilot and running from one thing to the next and, going in the car a million miles an hour. And, our schedules are packed. When our schedules aren't packed, we're watching TV or we're constantly keeping our minds busy so that we're never actually checking in and doing that deeper soul work, heart work, So this is an invitation to reconnect with yourself, to know what God is doing in you. And out of that, grow your connection to your community, family, friends, and beyond that, creation, the world that we live in.
I know in our introduction, you described yourself as a misfit mystic. And then you talked about kind of your own connection.
I'm Bill.
And I'm Jeremy.
And if you like what we're doing, I want to encourage you to subscribe.
You might even consider sharing it with a friend.
Or rating and reviewing us. That helps get the word out.
I hear if you review us, Happy Hippie Jesus will love you.
That's true. Now to the show.
Tell us a little bit about kind of your introduction or experience with mysticism. And then maybe if you can take us through a practice that you use that's really helped you connect with yourself and your soul better.
And would you mind kind of defining what a mystic is? Because for some of the Christian community, mystic almost seems like a bad word, and it's really not. It's part of our faith tradition.
Yeah, it's it's actually an integral part of our faith tradition, right? I mean, it's something, it's one of the foundations. And I think Jesus talks a lot about this. Western society, unfortunately, has kind of, packaged and printed and sold Christianity as this, show up on Sunday and check these boxes and do these things and believe these words and, say these creeds. And all of that is good. It benefits, there are some benefits to that. But it ignores the quiet, the soft, the internal. So yeah, when I think of mysticism, I think of kind of the other side of that duality, which is knowing God in and through you, in and through me, right? What God is doing in my heart, in my soul, in my mind. And tapping into that in a very intentional way, contemplation. And actually, Richard Rohr is doing a lot in this area right now. He's one of the first that has fused this idea of contemplation and action, really said, there are two sides of one coin. We can't be out in the world professing to be Christians and doing all the things that Christians are doing without having a deep understanding of, it's hard to even articulate this, this dwelling in and attending to the spirit that is present in all of us. So my story, coming to mysticism or contemplation is, I grew up in a evangelical, charismatic Christian tradition, lights and smokes machines and, bands. And that was great. It taught me a lot. I came to United Methodism in my adult years, young adult years, and that really helped to open some things up for me. But I found the mystic side when I got exposed to some of these contemplative Christian traditions that I had learned about through the Methodist Church, and then that sparked me to kind of go back and look at where did this come from. And I read a bunch about Hinduism and Buddhism and some of the connections between these various faiths. I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh and Pema Chodron and Richard Rohr and Thomas Merton and, some of these folks that had similar things to say. And it just resonated with something deeper in me. It got really below the surface into this part of me that I hadn't really tapped into. And so I started a regular meditation practice. And I like to differentiate this from what we think of as prayer, where I'm like talking to God, I'm giving God my list of things that I'm thinking about. And God, could you do this for me? And God, help me XYZ. That's an important part of my spirituality as well. But meditation is different. It's where I actually try to stop that narrative of telling God what I need and what he needs to do for me and how God can respond to me, and just listen for what God is doing, listen for how God is showing up in my life, listen for God in the silence. And it turned my spirituality upside down. It really changed my whole life. So I don't know if I don't know if that quite answers your question, but that starts to kind of talk a little bit about that practice for me.
I'm amazed you found it through the Methodist circles, because we tend not to be any better at it than the evangelicals.
Well, I will say I got my entry point there, but it took me a lot of my own searching to get beyond. So yeah, I had a couple of very interesting folks who introduced me, and then then it was through my own readings and other folks outside of the Methodist Church that kind of got me where I am.
I mean, the two people you named, Richard Rohr and Thomas Merton, for those who don't know, are both Catholic priests. Richard Rohr is still alive and teaching now, and has the School for Action and Contemplation out in, I think, New Mexico. And then Thomas Merton was a 20th century Catholic priest, and the Catholic tradition tends to be better at it than the evangelical, Methodist, or mainlines. And I think the Eastern Orthodox tend to be even better at it than the Catholic traditions as we look back through our history.
Yeah, and I will say one of the major influences in how I got exposed to contemplation is through the Jesuits. I lived in full-time as a community member in a homeless shelter in St. Louis City that was run by Jesuits, and we lived in this intentional community. And And I really started to dig in deep to contemplative practice and kind of the history of mysticism through that kind of Catholic Jesuit connection. So
now we're kind of off the subject of your book, but how did you end up living with Jesuit priests in a homeless shelter in St. Louis City? Like, that's a fascinating story.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a bleeding heart. You know, I'm like I said, I'm a social worker. I've always been interested in social justice and service. And so as I was graduating college and thinking about my next steps, you know, wanting to move more towards social work, but not really knowing where I wanted to go to grad school and what was going to happen next, I had been volunteering at this shelter in the city, in St. Louis City, and which, if you know anything about St. Louis City, you know, there's high rates of poverty and crime. And this particular homeless shelter was situated right smack dab in the middle of all of that. But I was just moved by the experience. And I had a professor in college who was the one who introduced me to the homeless shelter where I started volunteering. And as I neared graduation, they were looking for another community to come join in kind of their intentional living situation there and basically take a vow of poverty and move into a homeless shelter. And so I thought that was a great idea, you know, when I was 21 and graduating college and trying to figure out my next steps. And while I don't know that I would be able to do it again in that capacity, it changed my life. The experience changed my life and really led me to further my work in social work. And it furthered my understanding of spirituality and contemplation. So
it's so interesting that a lot of these spiritual disciplines that you suggest in your book that you've talked about are very solitary, but then they lead to community. I mean, what is it about these practices that can go from being solitary to community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in social work, we often operate out of systems theory, which is, you know, kind of to boil it down. Systems theory says when we start to work with a person, we can't understand their problem or their issue as isolated, right? We have to start with the individual, but then we also have to look at their concentric circles that impact them, right? Their community, their family, their environment, their social situation. And I think systems theory informs how we structure the book. But more than that, I think systems theory helps us to understand this depth of spirituality, right? Like, we can't serve other people. We can't be in communion with other people unless we start here in our own hearts and souls, right? We have to be able to tune into what God is doing in the quiet and depth of our own lives before we can offer anything of that to anyone else, right? Like, we can't pour from an empty cup is the idea. And so, you know, kind of constantly being tapped into the source of this fullness within ourselves is the starting place. But it gets pretty selfish and navel gazing, right? It turns into navel gazing if we stop there. And so the idea is that we start at the center of the circle, and then what God is doing in our heart, in our soul, in our lives, then overflows into connection with those around us, into the wider, you know, world, and how that love and depth pours out from us. So starting with self is essential. And I think a lot of Christian theology, well, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we say, you know, pour yourself out. Like, it doesn't matter that you're empty. You're always supposed to be selfish. You're always supposed to be serving. You're always supposed to be loving, you know, others. But we miss the part that, like, loving our neighbor like ourselves involves loving ourselves, being able to recognize ourselves as an equally necessary part of the kingdom of God, knowing that part of the kingdom of God in intimacy, and then being able to operate out of that part of the kingdom of God with, you know, with a sense of knowing, with a sense of security, right?
Certainly our sacred stories give us evidence and examples of people doing this. That Jesus guy that comes up every now and then seemed to constantly be going into the mountains by himself to pray and recharge and connect.
Exactly.
You know, and certainly even before that, you know, some of our prophets and things. And we have some pretty extreme examples of burnout in the Old Testament. You know, Elijah is thoroughly depressed and seems to be on the verge of suicidal in Kings, you know, when he gets sent out by himself and an angel comes and appears to him. He's like, have some food and a nap.
Exactly. Exactly. Why don't you stop? Yeah.
Which seems to be very much, you know, not like in light, but very much what you're suggesting. Take some time, breathe, connect with yourself, rest. Life will be better.
Again, I think it's this kind of gets to the countercultural piece, right? I think we understand ministry in the West to be, how much can I kill myself? How many hours can I spend? How, you know, like, I'm going to show everybody what a hard, quote unquote, hard worker I am and do this thing, right? And we take on the burden of salvation as if we are the savior, right? Not the one being saved. Whereas I think we're invited to actually just like let go a little bit, right? To not take ourselves so seriously and to be present, right? To be a human being rather than a human doing.
It was one of my Jewish rabbi friends, I forget which one, he said, Sabbath is important if for no other reason it teaches you you're not that important.
Yes, exactly. Like the world isn't going to stop if you whatever, don't do the things that you're supposed to do.
The world will go on without you.
It's going to be okay. Yeah.
Which is important for us to remember. So you're into the research more than me, and I talk a lot with my people about life being on a pendulum, and we tend to swing from one extreme to the other. Mm-hmm. It seems we've swung pretty hard to the technology always connected side. Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence that we're going to snap back and move to a healthier balance?
That is my hope. I mean, I think technology is always advancing, right? And there's tons of money flowing into, the next screen, the next iPhone, the next thing, whatever it is. And I get a sense that people are tired of it. Like they know that this isn't the answer to all of their problems. I think when it first came out, we were like, oh my gosh, wow, but we're starting to realize, oh, actually, no, like this is just one other tool. I've even heard of, like, I think some millennials, younger folks have actually decided to get like the old candy bar phones or the flip phones, like the unsmart phones, just as kind of a pushback. Like, no, I don't have to sign up to this. I don't necessarily have to be on other socials. I don't have to be, constantly being pinged with emails. I can have this if I need it, but otherwise I'm good. So my hope is that we're evolving to understand what balance looks like. Yeah.
I don't know. That kind of worries me because the bulk of our listeners listen to the show on iPhones and Android. It doesn't work too well on those flip phones.
No, no, it doesn't. But there is a new, like, I forget what it's called, but it's like a new flip phone, where I think you can, it's fancy in some ways, but like you can literally just turn off the internet and it doesn't have a screen. It's really interesting. Yeah. Maybe you guys are going to have to start, recording this to cassette tape and mailing them out or something.
Oh, yeah.
Ooh, that's too far of a snapback.
Yeah, that is kind of far of a snapback. They melt and they tend to melt in the mail sometimes.
Yeah.
Now, and they come all unwound and you got to
so annoying.
The whole pencil thing. Yeah. As you've talked today about contemplation and about these spiritual disciplines, it's not just for students, despite the fact that your book is pointed at students. I mean, I could see a small Sunday school class taking this book, even if they're, in their 80s and applying all these and just change student to senior.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think that's some of the, dreams those are some of the dreams that GBHEM has for this, because certainly it's not just for college students, and like I said, there taking this from a college version to a high school version by just simply changing some of the, examples, making it more developmentally appropriate. But this is, appropriate for small groups, for adults, for seniors, for, whoever. And my hope is that GBHEM does take this and translates it into, other groups of people that could work with this. But, the concepts behind it, the mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, these are all clinical, evidence-based practices that I use with my clients in my psychotherapy practice, every day. So, and I have clients from, 18 to 78. So it's certainly applicable across age groups and is not only applicable, but effective as well. So
I'll just say, I always think it's really cool when things that people have been doing for thousands of years, science comes along and is able to demonstrate, oh, that's really good for you. It turns out humanity knew what they were doing.
Yeah, good job, guys. Yeah.
Yes.
Success.
And I feel obligated to let you give all of us a pep talk. If we're to start mindfulness for the first time,
yes.
do you want to offer some words of grace or comfort or understanding to everyone who's going to get 5 seconds in and go, ooh, butterfly. Oh, hang on. Hang on.
Yes.
Ooh, grocery. Ooh, let me put that on my grocery list. Hang on.
Yes, I would love to. So your brain is made to think thoughts, right? That's what it was made to do. And so when you sit down and try to practice quiet, contemplative prayer, meditation, your brain will do what it's meant to do, which is think thoughts. And that's perfectly okay. You're doing it right. The idea is that you simply notice the thoughts. Notice that your brain is doing what your brain was created to do, which is keep you alive and keep you on task. And with compassion, greeting those thoughts. Oh, hi, grocery list. Hi, thanks. Okay, I don't need to think about that right now. I'll come back to it later, and then come back to the moment, right? So the thoughts will come, you'll get carried away, and then you'll notice, oh, I'm carried away in my thoughts. And then you greet that with compassion, take a breath, come back to the moment. So you're not supposed to be good at this, and especially not in the beginning. You can't fail. You can't, you don't get a grade for it. You just try, you practice. And then gradually, as you build up, you sit for a minute, then you sit for 2, and then you sit for 5, and then, you start noticing, oh, okay, I'm less distracted. I'm more centered. And the grocery list items come, later. They come at 7 minutes instead of 30 seconds. But the idea is that there's no wrong way to do it. Your brain is doing what it's meant to do. Let your brain do what it's meant to do, and then let it come back when you're ready, So have a lot of space for yourself as you try this, knowing that it is practice and it's just the coming back. That is the work.
And there's no one size fits all practice either. So one thing may be really fruitful for me, but another might be more fruitful for Jeremy, right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So me personally, I actually practice meditation in the Vipassana tradition, which is actually a Buddhist tradition that I just use through my Christian lens. And that involves, I literally sit for 30 minutes in silence a day, and that works for me. But that doesn't work for everybody. There's all kinds of different practices, right? So there's walking meditation, there's yoga meditation, and we go through this in the book, right? We talk about Lectio Divina, where you pull, some scripture and focus on just a few words and really delve into it. Or, the Daily Examen is another example. There's all kinds of ways to be contemplative. The idea is that you drop out of your head and into your heart space, right? 90% of the day we're operating from our neck up, logically scheduling, checking all the boxes and doing all the things that we do in our lives. And this is an opportunity to do something different, to drop down into your body, to drop down into your heart and soul, turn off that doing mode. And you can do that many, many ways. So,
and you can use your imagination. Lately, I have been putting technology to work for me in the current practice I'm using. I go for walks and I listen to a dramatic reading of the Bible, and it just feeds me.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And there's all kinds of different approaches that, Headspace and Insight Timer, and there's a bunch of different apps and online tools now that will give you, specific different types of meditations that will walk you through guided meditations. Yeah, there's, different readings of the Bible. There's all kinds of practices. So do what works for you, and also don't be afraid to be bad at it, quote unquote, right? To not feel like you're a pro. That's exactly how it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to be, quote unquote, good or bad. It's just, you're just trying. You're just coming back, Yeah,
this is really countercultural.
It's so
be
countercultural.
Bad at it. Get out of your head and into your heart space. I don't know. Some of our listeners probably have hives right now just thinking about that.
Yes.
Out of my head. It's not a competition.
What?
I can be bad.
Yeah. I tell you, though, the one thing that throws me out of that contemplation as I'm walking is the voice they have for God in the New Testament is Samuel L. Jackson. And I just keep jumping back to Pulp Fiction. I mean,
yeah, I could see that. Oh my.
Thank you so much for being on. As we kind of come to the end of our time together, we want to give you the opportunity to do two things. One, we ask this question to everyone when they're leaving, and that's just simply, what's saving your soul right now?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say the biggest thing is this meditation practice that I mentioned. It gives me clarity. It helps me to connect to God in new ways. I'm able to just let go in ways that I've never been able to let go before. I don't have to control everything all the time. And that is life-saving. I mean, especially someone like me who's coming from, rigid academic background where it's extremely competitive, extremely, white-knuckled. And it's been amazing for me to just be able to open my hands and learn to listen. So, yeah.
And the other question is, tell everyone where they can find you or how they can reach you. If you have a website, or if you're on any of the social medias, or if Bill finally realizes he needs therapy and wants to get in touch. I mean, whatever.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So my website is just drsarahbollinger.com, dsarahbollinger.com. You can contact me there, or you can email me at sarahbollingercounseling@gmail.com. And I'd always be happy to talk to folks, to answer any questions, to reach out for counseling, or just to bounce some ideas around. So, yeah.
And Bill will put links to all of those and your book in the show notes, because he has to do all of our work.
And that's how I know.
Great.
Yeah, that's how I know Jeremy is more spiritual than me, because I hear him praying often. Please God, let Bill do the work so I don't have to.
I love it.
Much like Samuel L., I just spoke it into existence. I started saying it on the podcast enough, and it became true.
That's great.
Yes, but thank you for being with us today. It's certainly a joy to have you, and forward to continue our conversation. And you really do have a really nice book out, and a really nice 8-week guide for students or adults or whomever that might want to take that up.
Yeah, I'm even going to recommend it to our youth director.
Oh, thank you all. Yeah, I really appreciate being on the show. I really appreciate what y'all are doing with this podcast, just kind of opening up conversations for new ways of thinking about God and Jesus's example in the world. And yeah, I was excited to share about the book, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'd be happy to touch base.
All right. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.